Okay, if you'll recall, the oldest fossils that have ever been found of plants are about 450 million years old, and they were a moss-like plant. So that means that they're non-vascular, seedless plants, and they dominated for about 300 million years, at least according to the fossil record. But then they were joined about 420 million years ago by uh, plants that were vascular, had vascular tissue. However, they still were seedless. In other words, they reproduced with spores, just like mosses do. So that's something they share with mosses, but they developed vascular tissue which allowed them to grow much larger than moss. So again, if we take a look at this figure, this photo, I'm sorry, we see the mosses growing on this log and growing on the rock, and they look like carpets because they're very tiny little plants, thousands of tiny little plants. Well, here we see the next evolutionary step. These are the ferns and their allies, as we say. There are others that are not considered ferns, but they're still seedless vascular plants. And the vascular tissue that they evolved allowed them to grow much higher off the ground into much larger plants, even the size of trees. So there were forests of these kinds of plants back after about 420 million years ago. And we call these tracheophytes. Trachea refers to a tube. For example, you have a tube that's called the trachea that carries air into your lungs. So these tracheophytes are plants that have tubes that transport water high off the ground into their roots and stems and leaves, or through their roots and stems and leaves. That's what we call a vascular plant. So vascular plants have two types of vascular tissue, and we can refer to those as subsystems because they really perform two separate functions. Xylem is one of them, and that's what we're seeing here. This is a microscopic view, a scanning electron microscopic view of the xylem tissue in a vascular plant. And these very smallest little tubes, and again, the tubes, the tracheophytes, trachea refers to tubes. These very smallest tubes here are known as tracheids. Okay, and so we're zooming in on the smallest little holes here in the cross section. And these tracheids were the first to evolve. But then later, larger vessels evolved. And so these larger tubes are referred to as vessels, and they're made up of vessel elements, what are known as vessel elements. So in other words, one cell is a vessel element. And a vessel is a long tube that's formed by vessel elements that are end to end, and they're hollow. And so you think to yourself, well, how can they be cells? How can they be hollow and carry water and be alive? And that's the point. They're not alive. They're dead. So once they form, they die. And they have cell walls that are very strong, fortified by cellulose as usual, because remember, plant cell walls have cellulose. But even another substance joins the cellulose known as lignin. Lignin is a substance that makes cell walls even more rigid, even stronger. And the combination of the cellulose and the lignin is what we refer to as wood. So wood is xylem. Xylem is wood. And the other thing to point out is what xylem transports. Xylem specifically transports water up from the roots through the stems and into the leaves. And it's mainly water, but there are minerals dissolved in that water. The water is coming from the soil, and there are minerals dissolved in the water in the soil. So xylem transports water up with minerals dissolved in it to deliver those minerals to different parts of the plant that needs it. And this is all part of the transpirational system that moves water up from the soil, through the roots, through the stems, and out into the leaves. That's known as transpiration, if you'll recall, because we were looking at transpiration when we studied the water cycle. And that concept is so important to plant structure and function that I decided to go ahead and add it to the slide here. So there's the word, transpiration. Xylem's primarily responsible for the transpiration of water from the soil up through the roots, through the stems, and into the leaves, up in the plant. And it's dead. And I'm pointing those out again because that's how you want to contrast it with the other vascular subsystem, which is known as phloem. phloem is living, and it transports sap, which contains dissolved sugars, carbohydrates, glucose, every which way in the plant, any direction that it needs to go. So both up and down and sideways, from what we call the source to the sink. The source being where the sugar is coming from, the sink being where the sugar needs to go, or where the sugar is being transported to. Source to sink. And so again, they're living and they're tubes, and so the cells that make up the sieve tubes, as they're known as, are known as sieve tube members. Okay, so there are sieve tube members that are the cells that make up the phloem tubes, the sieve tubes, and they call them sieve tubes because the cells are separated by sieve plates. So if we look under a microscope at the sieve plates, you can see they're full of holes, and that's how they're shown in the diagram too. So, but these are living cells. So now you're thinking to yourself, well, how can a hollow tube be made up of living cells? Well, the cells themselves are hollow, and they do transport sap, both, in whichever direction it needs to go. But the way they're kept alive are by these cells that are along with them, beside them, and in between them, known as companion cells. So you'll notice the companion cell here has its nucleus, has its, all the organelles that it would normally have, and it's connected to the sieve tube member by these holes, these pores, known as plasmodesmata. That's quite a word, huh? Plasmodesmata. And that's how the companion cell keeps the sieve tube member alive, is by the connection between their cytoplasms. And so that's how phloem is constructed to be able to transport sap, but still be made up of living cells. What I have here is further explanation of this concept of source to sink. So, which changes like seasonally. So in the summer and the fall, the leaves are producing sugar. They're photosynthesizing and producing sugar. So they are the source of the sugar. And the transport then is from the leaves down in the plant. A lot of it goes to the roots where it's going to be stored, because that's one of the functions of the roots, is to store sugar. So think of a carrot, for example. A lot of the carbohydrates, the sugars that are produced in the leaves in a carrot are going to be transported down into the carrot itself, what we call a carrot, which is the root. It's a root crop. So all that sugar is going to be stored in the roots in the summer and the fall. Then in the spring, after it goes through the winter, in the spring, the sugar needs to be transported from the roots back up into the stems and leaves to grow the leaves, right? So the leaves come back so they can start photosynthesizing again. So the sugar is being transported from the roots to the leaves. So phloem is responsible for this transport, whether it be from the leaves to the roots or the roots to the leaves. Phloem can transport it in any direction it needs to go, whenever it needs to go, in whichever direction. But it's from the source of the sugar to the sink where it needs to go. So when it comes to the seedless vascular plants, what we're talking about are ferns and their allies, as we say, or their relatives. And there are three primary phyla. You can think of the seedless non-vascular plants like mosses and their relatives. That's a clade. And the seedless vascular plants that we're looking at now, you can think of them as a clade. And the clade then is divided up into these phyla. So we've got the club mosses, which are the phylum Lycophyta, the horsetails, which are the phylum Arthrophyta, and the ferns, which are the phylum Pterophyta. And just like the seedless non-vascular plants, the mosses can be referred to as bryophytes, just using one of the phyla, one of the dominant phyla, as a way to describe the whole clade. It's the same for the seedless vascular plants here. The whole clade can be referred to as the Pterophytes, based on the phylum name of the ferns. And the Pterophytes, these seedless vascular plants, because they're the first to have vascular tissue, they're the first to have what's considered true roots, leaves, and stems. In other words, the definition of a true root, a true leaf, a true stem are roots and stems and leaves that contain vascular tissue. That's the key in the definition of a true root, stem, and leaf. So they contain xylem and phloem, those two transport subsystems that we see in vascular tissue. So these are the roots, true roots. The stem is kind of weird, though, in Pterophytes anyway, in ferns, because it runs horizontally, either just below the soil surface or barely sticking up from the soil surface. And then the leaves, which are known as fronds in ferns, are coming from the stem. So it's just like a vertically growing stem, the leaves will come off of the stem. In this case, it's simply that the stem is running horizontally along the surface of the ground, and then the leaves are branching off of the stem and growing up to capture the sunlight. But this means that the fern can kind of spread out along the ground. So if you see a frond coming up in one place and a frond coming up in another place, it might not be two separate individuals. It might be the same individual fern. So what's special about the ferns and their relatives or their allies is that they have vascular tissue, but like mosses, they are seedless. In other words, they reproduce with spores, and that means they still depend on water. Just like moss needs water for the sperm to swim to the egg, same with ferns. Ferns still need water for the sperm to be able to swim to the egg. So they tend to live in habitats where it's wet at least for part of the year. The other thing to point out before we move on is that what we're looking at here when we look at a fern plant is the sporophyte. Remember, all plants show alternation of generation. In mosses, the gametophyte is dominant, and the sporophyte, if you'll recall, is supported by the gametophyte and grows out of the gametophyte. In this case, the sporophyte is dominant. So the fern plant is the sporophyte, and the gametophyte is greatly reduced, as you'll see when we look at the life cycle. So the sporophyte is called the sporophyte because it produces spores. And remember, the sporophyte is diploid. Remember, diploid sporophyte, haploid gametophyte. Diploid sporophyte, haploid gametophyte. So the sporophyte is producing haploid spores by meiosis. And it does that in these clusters of sporangia that you'll find under the frond. So if you turn over the frond of a fern, you will be able to see sori. Now, they don't all look like this. Different species have different looking sori, and some of them have them covered up so that you see them as kind of like little bumps instead of being clusters of sporangia like we can clearly see here. But if we zoom in on one of these sori, you can see the individual sporangia that make them up. So it's a cluster of sporangia, and each sporangium is going to be producing spores by meiosis. So we go from the diploid sporophyte to the haploid spores. Those haploid spores then are going to germinate and give rise to the haploid gametophyte. So here's the haploid half of the life cycle, and we're coming from spores that are being produced from sporangia in sori on the underside of a fern frond here. So that's where we start. And again, those spores are being produced from the diploid sporophyte. We're going to haploid spores, so that means we need to reduce the number of chromosomes in half, and that's done by meiosis. So the spores are produced in each sporangium by meiosis. The spores then are going to germinate into a gametophyte. The gametophyte grows and develops, and it kind of looks like a heart-shaped structure, and it's very small. You can't tell from the diagram here, but this is very small, just a millimeter or two in size. And by the notch here in the heart, again, it's heart-shaped, so there's a notch at one end of the gametophyte, and by the notch, that's where you see the female reproductive structure developing, and that's known as the archegonium, just like in mosses, same term that we learned in mosses, archegonium. And at the base of the archegonium is kind of like the uterus of the archegonium. It's the venter. I didn't label it here, but it's the same term that we use in mosses. At the other end of the gametophyte are the male reproductive structures, or the antheridia, right? Both on the same gametophyte. So that means that both male and female are on the same plant. That makes it a hermaphrodite. It also makes it monoecious. We use that term to refer to a plant that has both male and female reproductive structures, monoecious. And so the male gametophyte, I'm sorry, the male antheridium is going to be producing sperm, and the female archegonium is going to have the egg. And the sperm is going to have to swim from the antheridium to the archegonium in water. So that means that the gametophyte has to be covered in water at some point for the sperm to be able to swim to the egg, just like we see in mosses. So the ferns are still dependent on water for their reproduction. So here we're looking at the diploid half of the life cycle, and so here we're coming, now that we've had fertilization, the sperm has fertilized the egg. That means we have a zygote, and it's a diploid zygote. That's what you get. That's how we go from haploid to diploid, is by fertilization, right? So the sperm fertilizes the egg. We have a zygote. That zygote is the sporophyte. That's the sporophyte zygote develops into the sporophyte embryo, and that, again, that's happening in the venter of the archegonium, and it grows right out of the archegonium. Just like in moss plants, the sporophyte grows out of the archegonium and is supported by the archegonium until it puts down its own roots. Then it's able to support itself. So it's just temporary. In mosses, it's basically permanent. The sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte and being supported by the archegonium. But in ferns, it's temporary, and eventually the sporophyte becomes dominant and is able to support itself. So here's the full fern plant with the rhizoid, the horizontal running stem and roots, and putting up fronds, all true root stems and leaves. And when a frond first starts to unfurl or grow from the rhizoid, we refer to that as a fiddlehead, because it looks like the end of a violin or a fiddle. But then the sori, when it's time for the sporophyte to produce spores, sori develop on the underside of the frond, and the sporangia that make up the sorus then start producing spores by meiosis, and the whole life cycle starts over again. They go back to haploid spores, right? So here's the whole life cycle together, and the only reason we're looking at this really is to just put it all together and point out that what we have just described is alternation of generation. Diploid sporophyte, haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte, haploid gametophyte, and that just that's how the life cycle takes place in plants, in all plants. But the difference here is from the mosses. In the mosses, the gametophyte was dominant and the sporophyte was not. And now that has switched, and that evolutionary trend continues, so that eventually when we get to the seed plants, because these are non-seed plants, right? They're spore-producing plants. They're seedless. When we get to the seed plants, you'll note that the gametophyte has been so reduced that it's only some cells that are inside the sporophyte. So far this has been all about ferns, and again, ferns are in the phylum Pterophyta, but we've got those two other phyla that you might be wondering about. So we've got the phylum Lycophyta, and if you're not going to remember that that's a phylum name, you might want to make sure you put phylum in front of it or P in front of it to remind you. Those are the club mosses. And this is what club mosses look like. And these are extant species. In other words, these are the species that are living today. And if you were walking through the forest, you might think, oh, well, there's a little baby pine tree or shrub or something. But that's not what these are. These are not going to get any bigger than what we see here. So these are very low-growing relatives of ferns, seedless, vascular plants that reproduce in the same way. So what we're looking at here are the sporophytes of these. And the gametophytes would be very small, and the sperm would have to swim to the egg, just like we saw in the fern life cycle. And there aren't that many species of these today, but they did have their time in the sun, so to speak. Back in the Carboniferous period, for example, the forests that covered the earth back at that time were made up largely of these kinds of plants, club mosses. They grew to the size of trees. and they made up the coal that we dig up today, or they make up, they fossilized as the coal, the fossil fuels that we dig up today. And finally, there's the phylum Arthrophyta. And arthro, that might sound familiar to you, like arthritis, right? Arthritis is a disease of the joints, and these are called Arthrophyta because if you look at the stem, and we can't really see that in this photo, but if you look closely at the stem, it looks like the stem has joints. Just like when you look at your finger has your knuckles, right? Your knuckle joints. That's what the stem of these Arthrophytes look like. But somebody also thought they looked like horsetails, and so that's why we call them horsetails. And that's actually the genus name is based on the fact that they look like horsetails, equisetum. If you'll note that someone who raises and rides horses is known as an equestrian. So it all kind of goes together there around the idea that they look like horsetails. They're also known as scouring rush, though, because you can use these. They're very abrasive, and you could use them to scour out pans. Like if you're cleaning a pan, you're out backpacking and you're cleaning a pan. If you find these things, you can pick one and use it to scour out your pan. So those are the seedless vascular plants. We've got the Pterophytes, which are the ferns, the Lycophytes, which are the club mosses, and the Arthrophytes, which are the horsetails or scouring rush. Next time we'll take a look at the next evolutionary step, which is the evolution of seeds and pollen. Pollen goes along with seeds.